The first thing I noticed about the abandoned hospital was that one room was clean, not cleaner than the others. Clean, the floor was swept, the bed was made, the curtains were hanging perfectly straight, even the small metal table beside the bed had been wiped down. That didn't make sense. The hospital had been closed for almost 9 years, no electricity, no staff, no patients, and according to the property manager, nobody had been inside the building for months. I was there because the hospital was scheduled for demolition. My job was simple. Walk through the building, photograph every room, document anything the demolition crew needed to know about. It wasn't exciting work, but the money was good. And after the first few days, I stopped thinking about the building as a hospital. It was just an old structure, long corridors, broken windows, peeling paint, empty rooms, the kind of place where every sound seemed louder than it should. On my second morning, I found room 214. The door was slightly open. I pushed it with my shoulder and stepped inside. The room looked completely different from the rest of the hospital. The walls were dirty, but the floor was spotless. There was an old hospital bed against the far wall. The mattress was still covered with a clean white sheet. A chair sat beside the window. The curtains were closed, and there was no dust on the bedside table. I stood there for a few seconds, then I took a photograph. I remember the exact photograph. The bed, the chair, the window, the empty wall, nothing unusual. I left the room and continued working. The following morning I went back. The door was still open. I stepped inside and immediately knew something had changed. The chair was no longer beside the window. It was beside the bed, facing the doorway. I thought maybe I had moved it without realizing. That seemed possible. So I took another photograph, then I left. That night, while reviewing my photographs at home, I compared the two images. The chair had definitely moved, but that wasn't what bothered me. It was the floor. In the first photograph, there was a thin layer of dust underneath the chair. In the second photograph, the dust was gone. Someone had moved the chair recently. I called the property manager. I asked him if another worker had been inside the building. He said no. Then he laughed and told me that old buildings make strange sounds. I didn't argue. The next morning, I put a small piece of clear tape across the edge of room 214. It was barely noticeable. If someone opened the door, the tape would break. I also took another photograph of the room. This time I photographed everything: the chair, the bed, the curtains, the table, the door. Then I left. When I returned the next morning, the tape was still there, unbroken. The door hadn't moved, but the room had changed. The chair was back beside the window, and the bed had been made again. The sheet that had been slightly wrinkled the previous day was perfectly flat. I stood in the doorway for a long time, then I walked inside. There was something on the bedside table, a paper cup. It wasn't old, it was white, clean. And there was still a little water inside it. I didn't touch it. I took a photograph, then I called the property manager again. This time he stopped laughing. He asked me which room I was in. I told him. There was a long silence, then he said, "Don't spend too much time in 214. I asked him why. He wouldn't answer. Instead, he told me to finish photographing the second floor and leave before sunset. That was the first time I realized he already knew about the room. I asked him if someone had been using it. He said no. I asked him when the room was last occupied. Another silence. Then he said 9 years ago. He hung up. I stayed in the room for another minute. Something about it had changed, not physically. It was the feeling. Before that conversation, room 214 had been strange. Afterward, it felt like I had walked into something I wasn't supposed to know about. I left, but I didn't stop thinking about it. That evening, I searched through the hospital's old records. The property manager had given me access to some documents because they were needed for the demolition report. Most of them were boring: maintenance reports, patient numbers, equipment inventories. Then I found an old floor plan. Room 214 was marked as a standard patient room, nothing unusual. But underneath the room number was another notation: observation room. I searched the hospital's archived patient records. Most of the names were meaningless to me. Then I found a patient assigned to 214, a man named Daniel Mercer, admitted 9 years earlier, no discharge date, no transfer record. No death certificate attached to the file, just one line, patient left hospital premises. That didn't make sense. If he had left, there should have been a discharge record. I kept looking. There was another document, a handwritten incident report. The handwriting was difficult to read. But one sentence was clear: patient missing from room at 2:17 a.m. I stared at the time, 2:17 a.m. The report said hospital staff searched the building. They found nothing. The police were contacted. Again, nothing. The official conclusion was that Daniel Mercer had left the hospital voluntarily. But something bothered me. There was no record of him ever leaving the building. No camera footage. No staff member who saw him go. Nothing. I closed the file. Then I noticed another photograph attached to the report. It showed room 214, the same bed, the same window, the same chair, but the photograph had been taken 9 years earlier. I zoomed in. There was something written on the wall above the bed, a small number, 214, nothing unusual. Then I noticed the chair. It was positioned exactly where I had found it that morning, beside the bed, facing the doorway. I stopped breathing for a second because that photograph was taken 9 years ago, and the chair was in exactly the same position. I went back to the hospital the next morning. I didn't tell the property manager what I had found. I wanted to see room 214 again. When I reached the second floor, the hallway was completely dark. The windows were covered with grime. The old fluorescent lights didn't work. I walked toward 214. The door was closed. That was unusual. I had left it open. I reached for the handle. Before I touched it, I heard something from inside. A soft scraping sound, like a chair being pulled across the floor. I froze. Then I heard it again. Slowly, carefully, the sound stopped. I opened the door. The room was dark. The chair was in the middle of the floor, facing me. I didn't move. Then I noticed the bed. Someone had pulled the sheet back, as if someone had recently been lying underneath it, and on the pillow was a fresh indentation. I stepped backward. That's when I heard a sound behind me, a door closing somewhere down the hallway. I turned around, nothing. The corridor was empty. I walked toward the sound. One door at the far end of the hallway was slowly swinging shut. I approached it. It was another patient room, empty. Completely empty, but on the floor in front of the doorway were footprints. Fresh footprints, bare feet. They came from the room and stopped halfway down the hallway. There were no footprints leading toward the room, only away from it. I followed them, one step at a time. They ended directly outside room 214. I looked at the door. Then I looked back at the empty hallway, and for the first time I realized something. The footprints weren't leading toward the room, they were leading out of it. I went back downstairs and left the building. I didn't return that afternoon. Instead, I called the property manager. I asked him one question: who was Daniel Mercer? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "You don't need to know." I asked him why room 214 was still being maintained. He said, "It isn't." I told him about the footprints. The silence on the phone lasted several seconds. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "Listen to me carefully. If you see that room clean again, don't go inside." I asked him what he meant. He hung up. That night I couldn't sleep. At around 2:30 in the morning, I checked the photographs from the hospital. There were dozens. I opened the most recent photograph of room 214. The chair was facing the doorway. The bed was made. The curtains were closed. I zoomed in on the photograph. Something was visible beneath the bed. At first, I thought it was a shadow. Then I realized it was a hand, a human hand. Pale fingers curled around the edge of the mattress. I immediately checked the original photograph. The hand wasn't there. It had appeared only after I uploaded the image to my computer. I stared at the screen, then my phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. There was no text, only a photograph. I opened it. It was room 214, taken from inside the room. The bed was visible, the chair was visible, the doorway was visible, and standing in the doorway was me. The The photograph had been taken from behind the bed, from inside the room. The timestamp said 2:17 a.m. I looked at the clock on my wall. It was 2:17 a.m. And then I heard something from downstairs, 3 slow knocks on my front door. I didn't move, 3 more knocks. Then my phone received another message. This time there were only 4 words. The room isn't empty. I didn't open the door. I stood in the middle of my living room staring at my phone. The message was still on the screen. The room isn't empty. 3 knocks came again. This time they were quieter, almost polite. I walked toward the window instead of the door and looked outside. Nobody was standing there. The street was empty. My car was parked where I'd left it. No headlights, no movement, nothing. Then my phone vibrated again, another photograph. I opened it. It was the hallway outside room 214. The photograph had been taken from the far end of the corridor. The lights were off. Room 214 was visible in the distance, and someone was standing outside it. I zoomed in. It was the same person from the photograph I'd received earlier. The person looked exactly like me. Same jacket, same jeans, same posture. I checked the timestamp. 2:19 a.m. I looked at my own clothes. I was wearing the same jacket, the same jeans. I hadn't been at the hospital. I hadn't left my house. At least I didn't think I had. I called the police. I told them someone might be inside my house. Then I waited. 20 minutes later, 2 officers arrived. They searched the house, every room, every closet, the basement, the backyard, nothing. One of them asked me if I'd been drinking. I said no. He looked at the photographs on my phone. He didn't say anything for several seconds. Then he asked me where the hospital was. I told him. He exchanged a look with the other officer. Finally, he said, "We've been there before." That surprised me. I asked why. He told me that 9 years ago, police had been called to the hospital because a patient named Daniel Mercer had disappeared. The same patient I'd found in the records. I asked what happened. The officer said the investigation had gone nowhere. But there was one detail that had never appeared in the official report. Daniel hadn't simply disappeared. Someone had locked him inside room 214 from the outside. The officer said the hospital staff claimed they didn't know who had done it, but one person had always suspected the truth. Daniel's older brother. His name was Thomas Mercer. I immediately thought about the photographs, the hidden service corridor, the room that kept being cleaned, the footprints. I asked if Thomas was still alive. The officer looked at me. Yes, then he gave me an address. It was less than 15 minutes from my house. I didn't go there that night. Instead, I stayed awake until morning. At sunrise, I went back to the hospital. I knew I shouldn't, but I needed to understand what had happened. The building looked different during daylight, less threatening. More ordinary. I entered through the same broken side door. I walked directly toward room 214. The door was closed. I opened it. The room was completely clean. The bed was made. The chair was beside the window. The floor was spotless. And sitting on the bedside table was the same paper cup I'd found days earlier, except now there was a name written on it, Daniel. I looked around the room. Then I noticed something beneath the bed, a loose section of flooring. I pulled it up. Underneath was a narrow wooden box. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Every photograph showed room 214. Some were old, some were recent, some had dates written on the back. The earliest photograph was taken 9 years ago. The newest had been taken 3 days earlier. I kept going. Then I found something that made everything suddenly make sense. The photographs weren't being taken by someone who lived in the hospital. They were being taken by someone who was documenting the room, someone who had been returning over and over. I found a small notebook underneath the photographs. The handwriting was neat, careful. The first page said Daniel was alive when they locked the door. I turned the page. The next entry described the night Daniel disappeared. According to the notebook, Daniel had become convinced that someone was entering his room at night. He told his brother that he kept waking up to find the chair facing his bed. He said someone was sitting there while he slept. The hospital staff dismissed it as paranoia. Then one night Daniel disappeared. Thomas had never accepted the official explanation. He believed somebody inside the hospital knew what happened, so after the hospital closed, he began returning. He kept room 214 exactly as Daniel had left it. He cleaned the floor, made the bed, moved the chair back into place, photographed everything. He was trying to find evidence. But there was another problem. Thomas had discovered a hidden maintenance passage behind the old laundry room. It connected to room 214. Someone had been using it during the hospital's final years. The passage was where Daniel had been taken. I found the entrance behind a damaged wall. It led into a narrow corridor. There were old electrical cables above me. Dust covered everything, but near the end of the passage, the dust disappeared. Someone had been walking there recently. I followed it. The passage ended behind room 214. There was a small opening in the wall. From there, someone could watch the room without being seen. I stood there for a long time. Then I noticed something scratched into the wood. A sentence. He didn't leave. I photographed it. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. A man was standing at the other end of the passage. Older, thin, wearing a dark coat. He didn't look surprised to see me. He simply said, "You found it." I knew immediately who he was. Thomas Mercer. I asked him what happened to Daniel. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked past me toward room 214. He opened the hidden panel. Then he looked at the bed. For the first time, his expression changed. He looked exhausted. He said, "My brother wasn't crazy." I asked him about the photographs. He told me he had taken most of them, but not all. I showed him the photograph of me standing in the doorway. His face went pale. I didn't take that. I showed him the second photograph, the one showing me inside the room. Again, he shook his head. Then I asked him who had been cleaning the room. He said, "Me." I asked why. He looked at the chair. Because Daniel always wanted it there. I asked him what happened that night. Thomas finally told me. Daniel had discovered that a hospital employee had been secretly entering certain rooms after midnight. The employee had been stealing medication and falsifying records. Daniel saw him. He threatened to report him. The employee panicked. He locked Daniel inside room 214 and used the maintenance passage to move him out of the hospital unnoticed. Daniel never came home. The hospital covered it up. The employee disappeared before the investigation could prove anything. Thomas spent years searching for him. Eventually, he found evidence that Daniel had been killed and buried somewhere outside the hospital. Police later recovered enough evidence to confirm Thomas's story. Daniel had never left voluntarily. The official record had been wrong. The room had been maintained because Thomas couldn't accept that his brother had simply vanished. But there was still one thing neither of us could explain: the photographs. I showed Thomas the one taken at 2:17 a.m., the photograph showing me standing inside room 214. He stared at it. Then he turned the photograph over. There was something written on the back. I hadn't noticed it before. 3 words. He came back. I asked Thomas what it meant. He didn't know. Then he asked me something. "When did you first enter room 214? I told him. He looked at the photograph again. "That's impossible." "Why?" "Because the camera that took this photograph was mine." He pulled an old camera from his bag, the same model, same lens. He showed me the memory card. It contained the original photograph, but the timestamp was different. The photograph hadn't been taken at 2:17 a.m. It had been taken 9 years earlier, the night Daniel disappeared. The person standing in the doorway wasn't me, it was Daniel. The photograph had somehow been altered. My face had appeared where Daniel's face should have been. We took everything to the police: the photographs, the notebook, the hidden passage, the evidence concerning Daniel. The investigation eventually confirmed the murder and the cover-up. Thomas finally got the answer he'd spent 9 years looking for. Room 214 was demolished with the rest of the hospital several months later. The case was officially closed. Thomas stopped returning to the property, and I never went back, but I still have one photograph from that hospital. The final photograph I took before leaving. It's a picture of room 214. The room is completely empty. No chair, no bed, no curtains, nothing except for one thing. In the dark doorway stands a man. His face isn't visible. His body is turned toward the camera, and behind him, written faintly on the wall, are 4 numbers, 217. I have no explanation for that photograph. The building was already abandoned when I took it. There was no electricity, no working camera system, and according to the police report, nobody else was inside. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe someone entered the building without us knowing. Maybe the camera malfunctioned, I don't know, but there's one thing I know for certain. Room 214 wasn't being kept clean because someone was living there. It was being kept clean because someone was trying to remember what happened, and whatever took those photographs wanted me to remember it too. That was the end of this story. If you've ever experienced something you still can't explain or have a strange story of your own, send it to Tales of the Dark. Your story could become the next nightmare featured on this channel. If you are new here, subscribe to Tales of the Dark, where every story gives you a nightmare.